The millionaire denied having a child with his maid, but collapsed when he saw the child at birth. Some men build walls so high they forget there's a world outside. The marble floors of the Adler mansion gleamed under the morning light, reflecting a silence that had become Grayson's closest companion. At 35, he had mastered the art of controlled perfection. Every gesture calculated, every word measured, every emotion locked away behind steel gray eyes that revealed nothing. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his home office, watching the Los Angeles skyline stretch endlessly before him. The Adler hotel chain had made him one of the youngest billionaires in the hospitality industry, but success had come at a price he'd convinced himself was worth paying. The soft knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Adler?" The voice was professional, crisp. "The new housekeeper has arrived." Grayson turned toward Mrs. Holloway, his elderly estate manager who had been with him for over a decade. She was one of the few people who could read the subtle shifts in his expression, though even she had never truly penetrated the fortress he'd built around his heart. "Send her in," he said, returning to his desk where contracts awaited his signature. The woman who entered was not what he had expected. Sophie Bennett moved with quiet confidence, her golden hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, green eyes alert and professional. She was beautiful in a way that wasn't trying to be noticed, natural, unpretentious, real. "Mr. Adler," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Sophie Bennett. Thank you for the opportunity." Her handshake was firm, her gaze direct. Most people who entered his presence carried themselves with either nervous deference or calculated charm. Sophie carried herself with simple dignity. "Mrs. Holloway will show you around," Grayson replied, his tone neutral. "The position is straightforward. Maintain the house, respect privacy, follow the schedule." "Of course." Sophie's response was immediate, professional. No lingering gaze, no attempt at small talk. She understood her role perfectly. As Mrs. Holloway led her away, Grayson found himself watching until they disappeared down the marble hallway. Something about Sophie Bennett had caught his attention, though he couldn't name what it was. Over the following weeks, Grayson observed Sophie's work with growing appreciation. She moved through his home like a gentle breeze, present but unobtrusive, efficient but never rushed. She treated his antique furniture with care, arranged fresh flowers with an artist's eye, and maintained a spotless environment without ever making him feel invaded. What struck him most was how she interacted with others. When his 8-year-old nephew Timothy visited, Sophie would quietly prepare his favorite snacks, engage him in conversation about his school projects, and somehow make the sterile mansion feel warmer. With the other staff members, she was kind but never gossipy, helpful without overstepping boundaries. Grayson began finding excuses to work from home more often. He would time his coffee breaks to coincide with moments when Sophie might be in the kitchen. He started noticing small details, how she hummed softly while working, how she always ensured fresh towels were perfectly folded, how she never presumed to rearrange his personal items but somehow made everything more organized. One evening, as autumn painted the Los Angeles hills in shades of gold, Grayson encountered Sophie in the library. She was carefully dusting his collection of first-edition novels, her movements reverent around the leather-bound books. "Do you read?" he asked, surprising himself by speaking. Sophie looked up, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. "When I have time, yes. These are beautiful books." "Take one if you'd like," Grayson offered, moving closer. "They're meant to be read, not just displayed." For a moment, something shifted in her expression. Surprise, perhaps even appreciation. But then the professional mask slipped back into place. "That's very kind, Mr. Adler, but I prefer to keep work and personal separate." Her smile was polite but final. It was a gentle rejection, delivered with such grace that Grayson almost admired it. Almost. As the weeks passed, these small interactions became the highlights of Grayson's carefully structured days. Sophie's presence had brought something indefinable to his home, not just cleanliness and order, but a sense of life that had been missing for longer than he cared to admit. He began leaving small gestures, her favorite coffee in the kitchen, a bonus in her monthly envelope, flexible scheduling when she mentioned needing time for personal appointments. But Sophie accepted these kindnesses with the same professional courtesy she showed everything else, never allowing them to change the careful distance she maintained. The fortress Grayson had built around his heart had never been tested by someone like Sophie Bennett, someone who didn't want to breach his walls. Someone who was perfectly content to remain on the other side. And perhaps that was exactly why, for the first time in years, he found himself wanting to open the gates. Late one October night, as rain drummed against the mansion's windows, Grayson sat alone in his study, staring at contracts he couldn't focus on. Down the hall, he could hear Sophie finishing her final tasks of the day, the soft sound of dishes being put away, the gentle click of lights being turned off. For the first time in his adult life, Grayson Adler found himself wondering what it would be like to not be alone in his perfect, empty mansion. But some walls are built so high the person inside forgets how to climb down. The heart remembers what the mind tries to forget. November arrived with an unexpected chill that seemed to seep through even the mansion's expensive insulation. Grayson found himself working longer hours, staying later in meetings, anything to avoid the quiet emptiness that awaited him at home. But somehow, Sophie's presence had made even the silence feel different, less hollow, more expectant. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows as Sophie prepared fresh coffee, her movements as graceful as always. Grayson entered, pretending to need his usual morning espresso, though they both knew he had a machine in his office. "Good morning, Mr. Adler," Sophie said without turning around, her voice carrying that familiar note of professional warmth. "Grayson," he corrected quietly. "You've been here 3 months. I think we can drop the formalities." Sophie's hands stilled for just a moment before continuing to measure coffee grounds. "I prefer to maintain professional boundaries, sir." There it was again, that gentle but firm wall she erected whenever he tried to bridge the distance between them. It should have discouraged him. Instead, it only made him more intrigued. The sound of running footsteps echoed through the hallway, followed by Timothy's voice calling out, "Uncle Gray, Uncle Gray!" Grayson's nephew burst into the kitchen, his backpack sliding off one shoulder, cheeks flushed from the cool morning air. At 8 years old, Timothy was the only person who could make Grayson's carefully controlled expression soften completely. "Hey, buddy," Grayson said, catching the boy in a brief hug. "What brings you here so early?" "Mom had an emergency meeting at the gallery," Timothy explained, settling onto one of the kitchen stools. "She said Sophie makes the best pancakes in the world." Sophie turned from the coffee maker, a genuine smile transforming her face. "Well, I don't know about the world, but I can certainly make you some breakfast." Grayson watched as Sophie moved around the kitchen with easy familiarity, pulling ingredients from cabinets, heating the griddle. Timothy chattered about his upcoming school project on ocean life, his enthusiasm infectious. "Did you know that octopuses have 3 hearts?" Timothy asked, directing the question to both adults. "I did not know that," Sophie replied, flipping a perfect golden pancake. "What else did you learn?" As Timothy launched into an animated explanation of marine biology, Grayson found himself studying Sophie's face. The professional mask had slipped, replaced by genuine interest and warmth. Her eyes crinkled slightly when she laughed at Timothy's dramatic retelling of a shark documentary, and she had flour on her left cheek that she hadn't noticed. Without thinking, Grayson reached out and brushed the flour away with his thumb. The moment his skin touched hers, Sophie went very still. Their eyes met and held for several heartbeats, long enough for Grayson to see something flicker in her green gaze before she stepped back, the professional distance snapping back into place like a rubber band. "Excuse me," she said quietly, turning back to the stove. Timothy, oblivious to the tension, continued talking about sea creatures while devouring his breakfast. Grayson remained at the counter longer than necessary, drinking coffee he didn't want, watching Sophie clean up with unnecessary focus on each dish. Later that afternoon, Grayson's assistant called with news that made his stomach clench. His grandmother, the woman who had raised him after his parents' deaths, who had been his anchor in a world that often felt unstable, had been hospitalized. By the time he reached Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, visiting hours were nearly over. His grandmother, Elena Adler, looked smaller than he remembered, fragile against the white hospital sheets. But her eyes were still sharp, still seeing too much. "Grayson," she said, her voice paper-thin but warm. "You came." "Of course I came, Grandma Elena." He took her hand, surprised by how delicate it felt. "How are you feeling?" "Old," she said with a weak smile. "But that's not what's important. Sit. Tell me about your life." For the next hour, Grayson found himself talking about things he usually kept locked away. The loneliness of success, the weight of expectations, the way his mansion felt more like a museum than a home. Elena listened with the patience she'd always shown, the same patience that had helped him survive the darkest period of his childhood. "You know what I regret most?" she asked as visiting hours wound down. "What's that?" "I taught you to protect yourself so well that you forgot how to let anyone in." Elena's eyes grew distant, I was so afraid the world would hurt you the way it hurt your father that I helped you build walls. But walls that keep pain out also keep love out. Mi nieto. Grayson felt something crack inside his chest. I don't know how to be different, Grandma. Start small, she whispered. Find one person who makes you want to try. That night, Grayson sat alone in his study, Elena's words echoing in his mind. Outside, the first real storm of the season was building, wind rattling the windows. The house felt larger than ever, every shadow deeper, every silence more profound. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Sophie stood in the doorway holding a steaming mug. I thought you might like some tea, she said quietly. Mrs. Holloway mentioned your grandmother was unwell. Grayson stared at her, this woman who maintained perfect professional distance but somehow noticed when he needed comfort. You didn't have to. I know, Sophie said simply, setting the mug on his desk. But I wanted to. For a moment, neither of them moved. The storm outside seemed to pause, waiting. Then Sophie turned to leave, and something in Grayson broke open. Sophie, he called. She stopped, looking back over her shoulder. Would you? He paused, feeling more vulnerable than he had in years. Would you stay just for a few minutes? Sophie's expression softened almost imperceptibly. After a long moment, she took the chair across from his desk. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the rain begin in earnest, both of them knowing that something fundamental had just shifted in the space between them. Sometimes the strongest walls crumble not from force, but from the gentle persistence of rain. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, a lifetime can shift. 3 weeks passed like pages turning in a book Grayson didn't want to finish. His grandmother's condition had stabilized, but the conversations in that sterile hospital room had left him raw, exposed in ways he wasn't sure how to handle. Elena's words about walls and love echoed in his thoughts during board meetings, followed him home through Los Angeles traffic, whispered to him in the quiet hours before dawn. Sophie seemed to sense his unsettled state. She moved through the mansion with even greater care, somehow managing to be present without being intrusive. Fresh flowers appeared in his study. His favorite coffee waited each morning, perfectly brewed, small kindnesses that she offered without expectation of acknowledgement. It was a Thursday evening in late November when the call came. Grayson was reviewing acquisition reports in his study when Mrs. Holloway knocked, her usually composed face pale with concern. Mr. Adler, she said quietly. The hospital called. It's your grandmother. The drive to Cedars-Sinai passed in a blur of red taillights and muted radio static. Grayson's hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white, his mind refusing to process what the doctor's careful words had really meant. Peaceful. No pain. She spoke about you at the end. Elena Adler, the woman who had taught him to tie his shoes, who had held him during thunderstorms, who had been the only person to truly see past his defenses, was gone. The funeral arrangements consumed the next few days in a haze of decisions and condolences. Business associates offered professional sympathy. Distant relatives emerged from years of silence to pay their respects. But through it all, Grayson felt disconnected from his own life, as if he were watching someone else navigate the rituals of grief. Sophie maintained her professional distance, but he caught her watching him sometimes with an expression he couldn't quite read. She handled the logistics of hosting guests at the mansion with quiet efficiency, ensuring everything ran smoothly, while he dealt with lawyers and funeral directors. The service was held on a crisp December morning at Forest Lawn, the same cemetery where his parents rested. Grayson stood at the graveside in his perfectly tailored black suit, surrounded by people who knew Elena Adler as a philanthropist, a socialite, a pillar of Los Angeles society. But none of them had known her as he had, as the woman who made hot chocolate on rainy afternoons, who taught him that strength could be gentle, who loved him unconditionally when the rest of the world felt conditional. As the last guests departed and the cemetery fell quiet, Grayson found himself alone beside the fresh grave. The afternoon sun slanted through the oak trees, casting long shadows across the manicured grass. He had held himself together through the service, through the reception, through all the necessary performances of grief. But now, in the silence, something inside him began to fracture. He drove home through the familiar streets of Beverly Hills, but nothing felt familiar anymore. The mansion, when he finally pulled through the gates, seemed like a monument to everything Elena had warned him about. Beautiful, perfect, and utterly empty. Months. Holloway met him at the front door with quiet condolences and the information that she had given the staff the evening off out of respect. The house stretched before him, vast and echoing, filled with shadows that seemed deeper than usual. Grayson loosened his tie and walked to the bar in his study, pouring 3 fingers of the Macallan Elena had given him for his last birthday. The whiskey burned, but it didn't fill the hollow space in his chest. A soft knock interrupted his solitude. Sophie appeared in the doorway, still wearing the simple black dress she had worn to the service. She had been there, he realized, standing respectfully in the back, honoring a woman she had barely known out of consideration for him. "I thought you'd gone home," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "Mrs. Holloway asked me to make sure you had everything you needed before I left." Sophie's voice was gentle, careful. "Can I get you anything? Something to eat?" Grayson shook his head, taking another sip of whiskey. "I'm not hungry." Sophie hesitated in the doorway, and for a moment, Grayson thought she would leave. Instead, she stepped into the room, her movements uncertain for the first time since he'd known her. "She talked about you," Sophie said quietly. Grayson looked up, surprised. "When?" "That day I brought you tea. After you went to see her, she called the house. She wanted to make sure someone was taking care of you." Sophie's hands were clasped in front of her, her professional composure wavering. "She said you were the best thing in her life, but that you'd forgotten how to let yourself be happy." The words hit him like a physical blow. Grayson set down his glass with shaking hands, the control he'd maintained all day finally beginning to crumble. "I don't know how," he whispered. "I don't know how to be the person she wanted me to be." Sophie's careful distance dissolved. She crossed the room and sat in the chair across from his desk, the same chair she had occupied that stormy night weeks ago. "Maybe you don't have to be someone different," she said softly. "Maybe you just have to be yourself without all the walls." For a long moment they sat in silence. The grandfather clock in the corner marked the passage of time with steady, relentless ticks. Outside, Los Angeles hummed with its usual evening symphony of traffic and distant music. "I was 7 when my parents died," Grayson said suddenly, the words coming from a place he rarely accessed. "Car accident on the Pacific Coast Highway. Elena found me at the hospital, crying in a room full of strangers. She took me home that night and never let me feel alone again." Sophie listened without speaking, her green eyes reflecting a compassion that made something ache in his chest. "She taught me everything," he continued. "How to be strong, how to succeed, how to survive. But she also taught me to be careful, to protect myself. And maybe I got so good at protecting myself that I forgot how to live." The whiskey had loosened something inside him, or perhaps it was grief, or perhaps it was the way Sophie was looking at him. Not with pity, but with understanding. "You're living now," Sophie said quietly. "Grief is living. Missing someone is living. Being afraid to be happy, that's living too." Grayson stood up abruptly, the weight of the day and the whiskey making him unsteady. Sophie rose as well, concern flickering across her features. "Maybe you should get some rest," she said. "It's been a long day." But Grayson didn't want rest. He didn't want to face the empty bedroom, the silent hallways, the crushing weight of solitude that awaited him. For the first time in his adult life, he didn't want to be alone. "Don't go," he said, the words escaping before he could stop them. "Please, don't go." Sophie's breath caught. In the lamplight, her golden hair seemed to glow, her green eyes wide with something that looked like longing. And in that moment, with grief and whiskey and 3 months of careful distance between them, something inevitable finally began. Some moments divide a life into before and after. The air in the study grew thick with unspoken words. Sophie stood frozen, her green eyes searching Grayson's face as if trying to decipher a language she'd never learned. The grandfather clock continued its relentless rhythm, but time itself seemed suspended in the space between his plea and her response. "Grayson," she whispered, his name falling from her lips like a prayer or a warning. He took a step closer, and she didn't move away. For the first time in 3 months, the careful distance she maintained crumbled completely. He could see the conflict in her expression, professional boundaries warring with human compassion, duty fighting against something deeper. "I know I shouldn't ask," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know this isn't appropriate, but I can't be alone tonight. Not tonight." Sophie's breath hitched. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, and Grayson realized she was as affected by this moment as he was. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. She hadn't been indifferent to the tension between them. She had simply been stronger than he was at resisting it. "I don't want to take advantage," he continued, moving closer still, "of your kindness. of this situation. But Elena was right. I've spent so long protecting myself that I forgot how to ask for what I need. What do you need? Sophie asked, her voice barely audible. The question hung between them, loaded with possibilities and dangers. Grayson reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face with one hand. Her skin was warm, soft, real in a way that made his chest ache. I need to feel alive, he admitted. I need to remember what it's like to connect with someone, to be vulnerable, to stop being afraid. Sophie's eyes fluttered closed at his touch, and when she opened them again, something had shifted. The professional mask she wore so carefully had finally, completely fallen away, revealing a vulnerability that matched his own. This changes everything, she whispered. I know. We can't go back after this. I don't want to go back. The admission seemed to break the last of her resistance. Sophie stepped into his space, closing the distance between them, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. Through the fabric of his shirt, he could feel the warmth of her palms, the slight tremor that betrayed her own uncertainty. Tell me about her, Sophie said suddenly. Tell me about Elena. Help me understand who you really are. So he did. In the dim lamplight of his study, with Sophie's hands anchoring him to the present, Grayson spoke about the woman who had shaped him. He told her about Elena's garden, where she had taught him the names of flowers, about the bedtime stories she made up, featuring a brave knight who learned that true strength came from caring for others, about the way she hummed while making his favorite cookies, how she never missed a school play or soccer game, how she had been both mother and father to a broken little boy. Sophie listened with an intensity that made him feel truly seen for the first time in years. She asked questions that showed she understood not just the facts of his story, but the emotions beneath them. When his voice broke talking about Elena's final words in the hospital, Sophie's thumb brushed away a tear he hadn't realized had fallen. She sounds extraordinary, Sophie said softly. She was the only person who ever loved me unconditionally, Grayson replied. And now she's gone, and I don't know how to what? How to deserve that kind of love again. Sophie's green eyes were luminous in the lamplight, filled with a tenderness that made his heart race. Maybe you don't have to deserve it, she said. Maybe you just have to accept it. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Grayson searched her face, seeing his own longing reflected back at him. The woman who had maintained perfect professional distance for months was looking at him like he was something precious, something worth reaching for despite the risks. Sophie, he breathed, and her name on his lips sounded like a revelation. She rose on her tiptoes, closing the last inches between them, and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if they were both afraid the other might disappear. But then Sophie's arms wound around his neck and Grayson pulled her closer, and the careful control they had both maintained for so long shattered completely. There was nothing careful about the way they came together after that. Nothing professional or appropriate or sensible. In the study where he had spent countless lonely hours, Sophie became the answer to questions he hadn't known how to ask. She was warmth against his coldness, softness against his hardness, acceptance against his fear. They moved through the mansion like sleepwalkers, hands entwined, stopping to kiss against walls and doorframes, unable to let go of each other long enough to think clearly. In his bedroom, the space no one else had ever been invited into, Sophie looked around with wonder at the books scattered on his nightstand, the framed photo of Elena on his dresser, the evidence of the man behind the Millionaire facade. Are you sure? He asked one last time, his hands framing her face. Instead of answering with words, Sophie began unbuttoning his shirt, her fingers steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to do. And then there were no more words, no more doubts, no more walls between them. They made love slowly, tenderly, with the reverence of two people who had been denying their desire for months. Grayson memorized every soft sigh, every gentle touch, every moment of connection that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. In Sophie's arms, he found a peace he hadn't known he was searching for. Afterward, they lay entwined in the darkness, her head on his chest, his fingers tangled in her golden hair. The house around them was silent, but it no longer felt empty. For the first time since Elena's death, Grayson felt like he could breathe. Thank you, he whispered against Sophie's temple. For what? For seeing me, for staying, for making me remember what it feels like to be human. Sophie lifted her head to look at him, her green eyes serious in the moonlight streaming through his bedroom windows. What happens tomorrow? It was the question neither of them had wanted to voice. Tomorrow would bring reality, consequences, the need to navigate what they had just done. But tonight, wrapped in each other's warmth, tomorrow felt very far away. I don't know, Grayson admitted, but I know I don't want to pretend this didn't happen. Sophie smiled, the expression transforming her face with a joy he had never seen before. Good, she said simply, because neither do I. But in the space where hearts meet, tomorrow always comes too soon. Dawn has a way of making dreams feel like mistakes. Sophie woke to the sound of running water and the absence of warmth beside her. The California sun streamed through unfamiliar windows, and for a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then reality crashed over her like a cold wave. She was in Grayson Adler's bedroom in his bed, wearing nothing but the scent of his cologne and the memory of his hands on her skin. The shower was running in the ensuite bathroom. She could hear him moving around, the ordinary sounds of morning routine that felt surreal after the extraordinary intimacy they had shared. Sophie pulled the Egyptian cotton sheet around herself and sat up, suddenly acutely aware of her vulnerability. What had she done? The question echoed in her mind as she gathered her scattered clothes from the floor. Her black dress from the funeral lay crumpled near the window, a stark reminder of what had led to this moment. Grief, loneliness, the dangerous combination of a broken man and a woman who cared too much. The shower stopped. Sophie's pulse quickened as she heard Grayson moving around the bathroom. She dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with buttons and zippers, trying to restore some semblance of the professional composure that had protected her for so long. When Grayson emerged from the bathroom, he was already dressed in one of his perfectly tailored suits, his dark hair slicked back, his expression unreadable. The vulnerable man who had whispered her name in the darkness had been replaced by the controlled millionaire she recognized from their first meeting. "Good morning," he said, his tone carefully neutral. Sophie's heart sank. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that the morning would bring tenderness, not this careful politeness. "Good morning." An awkward silence stretched between them. Grayson adjusted his cufflinks, a nervous gesture she had never seen before. Sophie smoothed her dress, acutely aware that she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had spent the night in her employer's bed. "I should go," she said finally. "Mrs. Holloway will be arriving soon and the other staff—" "Of course," Grayson interrupted, relief evident in his voice. "That's probably best." Sophie felt something twist painfully in her chest. She had expected this, had known, even in the heat of the moment that morning would bring complications. But she hadn't expected him to look at her like she was a problem to be solved, a mistake to be managed. "About last night," Grayson began, his businessman voice firmly in place. "It's fine," Sophie said quickly, not wanting to hear whatever careful explanation he was preparing. "You were grieving. We both. It was an emotional situation. These things happen." Something flickered in Grayson's eyes. Disappointment, perhaps, or relief. Sophie couldn't tell which, and she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Right," he said. "Exactly. It was circumstances." The word hit Sophie like a slap. Circumstances. As if the most beautiful night of her life had been nothing more than convenient timing and emotional manipulation. As if the man who had held her like she was precious had been an illusion created by whiskey and grief. "I should get breakfast started," Sophie said, moving toward the door with as much dignity as she could muster. "You have that conference call with the Singapore investors at 9. "Sophie, wait." She paused at the threshold, hope fluttering dangerously in her chest. "This doesn't have to change anything," Grayson said. "Your job, I mean. You're excellent at what you do. I wouldn't want this to affect your position here." Sophie closed her eyes briefly, fighting back the sting of tears. Of course, he was worried about a sexual harassment lawsuit, about complications in his perfectly ordered life. The man who had told her she made him feel alive was already back to thinking of her as the help. "Of course not, Mr. Adler," she said, the formal address sliding back into place like armor. "I'm very professional." If Grayson noticed the return to formality, he didn't comment. "Good. That's good." Sophie left his bedroom and walked through the mansion's quiet hallways, her footsteps echoing on the marble floors. Everything looked the same as it had yesterday, but she felt fundamentally changed. The walls that had seemed elegant now felt like a prison. The flowers she had carefully arranged seemed to mock her with their beauty. In the kitchen, she went through the motions of preparing breakfast with mechanical precision. Coffee, perfectly brewed, fresh fruit, artfully arranged, toast, golden and warm. All the small acts of care she had performed for months, now feeling hollow and strange. Mrs. Holloway arrived promptly at 7:30, bustling in with her usual efficiency. If she noticed Sophie's pale complexion or the slight tremor in her hands, she didn't comment. "How is Mr. Adler this morning?" Mrs. Holloway asked, organizing the day's schedule. "Fine," Sophie replied, not trusting herself to say more. Grayson appeared in the kitchen at exactly 8 o'clock, as was his routine. He looked impeccable, controlled, every inch the successful businessman. When their eyes met briefly across the kitchen island, Sophie saw nothing of the man who had whispered her name in the darkness. "Good morning, Mrs. Holloway," he said warmly. Then, with careful neutrality, "Sophie, Mr. Adler," Sophie replied, setting his coffee cup down without their fingers touching. Mrs. Holloway looked between them with shrewd eyes but said nothing. The older woman had worked for the Adler family long enough to recognize undercurrents, though Sophie doubted she could guess their true nature. "Your 9 o'clock called to confirm," Mrs. Holloway reported. "And your sister phoned. Timothy's school play is next Friday. She wanted to know if you'd be attending." "Of course," Grayson said, sipping his coffee. "Put it on my calendar." Normal conversation, normal morning routine, as if nothing had changed. As if Sophie's world hadn't been turned upside down and shaken until everything she thought she knew about herself had scattered like broken glass. "I'll be in my study," Grayson announced, gathering his coffee and newspaper. He paused at the kitchen door, and for a moment Sophie thought he might say something more. Instead, he simply nodded and left. Sophie spent the rest of the morning in a strange kind of suspension, performing her duties while feeling disconnected from her own body. She cleaned rooms that didn't need cleaning, reorganized closets that were already perfect, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from dwelling on the growing ache in her chest. It wasn't until she was dusting Grayson's study, the room where everything had begun, that the full weight of her situation hit her. She was in love with a man who saw their night together as a mistake. She had given her heart to someone who was already rebuilding the walls she thought she had helped him tear down. The worst part was that she couldn't even blame him. She had known the rules when she took this job. She had maintained professional boundaries for months, understanding exactly why they existed. And in one night of weakness, his weakness, her own, she had thrown away everything she had worked so hard to build. As she straightened the papers on his desk, Sophie noticed a business card that hadn't been there before. Hamilton and Associates, a law firm she recognized as specializing in employment issues. The card was placed prominently, deliberately visible. Her blood turned to ice. Was he already consulting lawyers? Planning to fire her with some kind of settlement to ensure her silence? The grandfather clock in the corner chimed noon, its sound echoing through the suddenly suffocating room. Sophie set down her dustcloth with trembling hands and walked to the window, staring out at the manicured gardens that had once seemed like paradise. She had made the biggest mistake of her professional life, and possibly the biggest mistake of her heart. But sometimes the heart's biggest mistakes feel like the only honest thing it's ever done. Some truths have a way of making themselves known, no matter how deeply we try to bury them. 3 weeks had passed since that December night, and Sophie had become a master of pretending. She pretended that her heart didn't skip when Grayson entered a room. She pretended that his carefully polite good mornings didn't feel like tiny cuts. She pretended that she hadn't replayed every moment of their night together until the memories felt worn thin from handling. Most of all, she pretended that everything was fine. But her body, it seemed, had other plans. The nausea started subtly, a queasy feeling when she smelled the coffee she prepared each morning, a slight dizziness when she bent to dust the lower shelves. Sophie attributed it to stress, to the emotional whiplash of loving someone who had made it clear she was a mistake he preferred to forget. It wasn't until she found herself rushing to the powder room off the kitchen for the third morning in a row that the impossible possibility began to take shape in her mind. No, it couldn't be. They had been careful that night, hadn't they? The details were hazy, blurred by grief and longing, and the overwhelming need they had both felt to connect. But surely, Sophie's hands shook as she gripped the marble edges of the sink, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her face was pale, her green eyes wide with growing panic. She did quick mental calculations, dates, symptoms, the timing of everything that had felt so right 3 weeks ago and now felt like the foundation of her life cracking apart. "Sophie?" Mrs. Holloway's voice called from the kitchen. "Are you all right, dear?" "Fine," Sophie called back, her voice artificially bright. "Just checking something." She splashed cold water on her face and returned to the kitchen. where Mrs. Holloway was sorting through the day's mail with her usual efficiency. The older woman looked up with concerned eyes. "You've been looking a bit peaked lately," Mrs. Holloway observed. "Perhaps you should take the afternoon off. Get some rest?" "I'm fine, really," Sophie insisted, though the smell of the bacon Mrs. Holloway was preparing for Grayson's breakfast made her stomach lurch dangerously. Mrs. Holloway studied her with the sharp gaze of someone who had raised 3 children and managed countless household crises. "When's the last time you took a proper break? You've been working non-stop since Mr. Adler's grandmother passed." The mention of Elena's funeral, and everything that followed, made Sophie's chest tighten. "I like to stay busy." "Busy is one thing. Running yourself into the ground is another." Mrs. Holloway's tone brooked no argument. "Take the afternoon. Go see a doctor if you're feeling unwell. That's an order." Sophie wanted to protest, but another wave of nausea made the decision for her. "Maybe you're right. Just a few hours." The drive to the CVS pharmacy felt like the longest journey of her life. Sophie sat in her second-hand Honda in the parking lot for nearly 10 minutes, staring at the automatic doors and trying to work up the courage to walk through them. Inside those doors was confirmation of what she already knew in her heart. Confirmation that would change everything. The pregnancy test aisle felt like it stretched for miles. Sophie grabbed the first box she saw and a bottle of water, her hands trembling as she approached the checkout counter. The teenage cashier barely looked up, treating her potential life-altering purchase with the same bored efficiency she would show for gum or magazines. Back in her small apartment in Echo Park, Sophie sat on her bathroom floor and stared at the test in her hands. 2 lines. Clear, unmistakable, life-changing lines. She was pregnant with Grayson Adler's child. The sob that escaped her throat seemed to come from somewhere deep and primal. She pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to contain the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Fear, joy, terror, wonder, love for the tiny life growing inside her, and heartbreak for how complicated that love made everything. What was she supposed to do now? Tell the man who had made it crystal clear that their night together was a regrettable mistake that she was carrying his baby? Watch him try to manage the situation with lawyers and NDAs and careful financial settlements? Sophie's phone buzzed with a text from her best friend Iris, a nurse at UCLA Medical Center who had been her anchor through every crisis for the past 5 years. "Coffee later? You've been MIA and I'm worried." Sophie stared at the message, then at the test in her other hand. She needed to tell someone. She needed advice, support, a voice of reason in the chaos of her thoughts. "Can you come to my place instead? I need to talk." Iris arrived 30 minutes later with takeout Thai food and the no-nonsense energy that made her excellent at handling medical emergencies. She took one look at Sophie's tear-stained face and immediately wrapped her in a hug. "Okay, what happened? Did that rich boss of yours finally cross a line? Because I have pepper spray and 0 patience for entitled men." Sophie led her to the couch, the pregnancy test still clutched in her hand. "It's more complicated than that." "How complicated are we talking? Like he made inappropriate comments complicated, or like you're in love with him complicated? Like I'm pregnant with his baby complicated?" Iris went very still. Then she took the test from Sophie's hand, studied it, and set it carefully on the coffee table. "Okay, tell me everything." So Sophie did. She told her about the funeral, about Grayson's vulnerability, about the night that had felt like the most natural thing in the world and the morning that had made her feel like a fool. She told her about 3 weeks of careful professionalism, of pretending her heart wasn't breaking every time he looked through her like she was invisible. Iris listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions, her medical training evident in how she processed the information. "How far along do you think you are?" Iris asked finally. 3 weeks, maybe 4. I need to see a doctor to be sure, but..." Sophie gestured at the test. "And you haven't told him?" "How can I? Iris, you should see how he's been acting. Like that night never happened. Like I'm just the help again. If I tell him about this..." Sophie's voice broke. "He'll think I'm trying to trap him. That I planned this somehow." Iris was quiet for a long moment, her brown eyes thoughtful. "Do you want this baby?" The question was simple, but it cut straight to the heart of everything. Sophie pressed her hand to her still flat stomach, imagining the tiny life growing there, a piece of her, and a piece of the man she loved despite everything. "Yes," she whispered. "I know it's crazy and the timing is impossible, and he doesn't want me, but yes, I want this baby." "Then that's what matters," Iris said firmly. "Everything else is just logistics." "Logistics?" "Iris, I'm pregnant with a billionaire's baby. This isn't exactly a normal situation. No, but it's your situation, and you're stronger than you think. Iris leaned forward, her expression serious. The question is, what do you want to do about him? Sophie stared out her apartment window at the Los Angeles skyline. Somewhere in the distance lay the mansion where Grayson was probably working late, oblivious to the fact that his entire world was about to change. I don't know, she admitted. I know I should tell him. He has a right to know, but I'm terrified of how he'll react. He might surprise you, Iris said gently. Sophie thought about the man who had whispered her name in the darkness, who had told her she made him feel alive. Then she thought about the cold stranger who had called their night together, circumstances. Or he might break my heart all over again, Sophie said quietly. Outside, the sun was setting over Los Angeles, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, beautiful and fleeting, like so many precious things. Sophie placed her hand over her stomach again, a protective gesture that was already becoming instinctive. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't be facing it alone. She had this tiny life growing inside her, and for the first time in weeks, that felt like enough. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves whether we're ready or not. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's speaking truth while your heart is breaking. Sophie spent 2 more weeks living with the secret, 2 weeks of watching her body begin its subtle transformation, while maintaining the careful facade of normalcy. Her jeans grew snug around the waist. The smell of Grayson's morning coffee made her nauseous. Mrs. Holloway's concerned glances became more frequent, though the older woman was too polite to voice her suspicions directly. Most torturous of all was working around Grayson himself. He had perfected the art of being professionally cordial, pleasant enough to avoid awkwardness, distant enough to maintain the walls he had rebuilt with surgical precision. Sometimes Sophie caught him watching her with an unreadable expression, but the moment their eyes met, his face would return to that careful neutrality that cut deeper than any harsh word could have. It was a Tuesday morning in late January when everything came to a head. Sophie was arranging fresh flowers in the main hallway when a wave of dizziness hit her with unexpected force. She gripped the marble table for support, breathing deeply as the world tilted around her. Sophie? Grayson's voice came from behind her, sharp with concern. She turned too quickly and the movement sent another wave of vertigo through her system. Grayson was at her side in an instant, his hand steady on her elbow, his gray eyes filled with the kind of worry she hadn't seen since the night of Elena's funeral. I'm fine, she said automatically, though they both knew it was a lie. You're pale as paper, Grayson said, his professional distance cracking. When's the last time you ate something? The concern in his voice was almost her undoing. For a moment he sounded like the man who had held her through the night, who had whispered that she made him feel alive, but she couldn't let herself hope, not when she had news that would only drive him further away. I should sit down, Sophie admitted, hating how weak she sounded. Grayson guided her to the living room, his hand remaining protectively on her arm. He helped her settle onto the cream-colored sofa, then disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with a glass of water and a concerned Mrs. Holloway in tow. I knew something was wrong, Mrs. Holloway fussed, pressing the back of her hand to Sophie's forehead. You've been looking peaked for weeks. Have you seen a doctor? Sophie's eyes met Grayson's over Mrs. Holloway's head. Something flickered in his expression, a recognition perhaps, or a terrible dawning suspicion. She saw the exact moment when the pieces clicked into place in his sharp mind. His face went very still, his body tensing like a predator suddenly aware of danger. Mrs. Holloway, Grayson said quietly, his voice carefully controlled. Could you give us a moment, please? The older woman looked between them, her experienced eyes noting the sudden tension in the room. Of course. Sophie, dear, I'll be in the kitchen if you need anything. The silence that followed her departure was deafening. Sophie could hear her own heartbeat, could feel Grayson's gaze boring into her like a physical weight. When she finally found the courage to look at him, his expression was unreadable, not angry, not hurt, just closed off in a way that made her chest ache. How long have you known? His voice was steady, businessman calm, giving nothing away. Sophie's hands trembled around the water glass. 2 weeks. And you weren't going to tell me. It wasn't a question. Sophie set the glass down carefully, buying herself a moment to find her voice. I was trying to figure out how. How to tell me, or how to handle it without telling me. The question hit like a slap. Sophie looked up sharply, seeing something cold and calculating in his eyes that made her stomach twist with more than morning sickness. I would never keep this from you, she said fiercely. Whatever you think of me, I'm not manipulative. I'm not trying to trap you or, aren't you? Grayson stood abruptly, pacing to the window with the same restless energy she remembered from their first meeting. You work in my house. You know exactly what I'm worth. And conveniently you're pregnant after one night together. The words hit Sophie like physical blows. She stood as well, fury overriding the dizziness that had brought them to this moment. Conveniently, her voice was ice cold. You think I planned this? That I somehow orchestrated your grandmother's death and your grief so I could seduce you into getting me pregnant? Grayson's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. I don't know what to think. 3 weeks ago, you were the perfect professional employee. Now you're carrying my child and looking at me like I've betrayed you somehow. You did betray me, Sophie said quietly, and the admission hung between them like a blade. Maybe not intentionally, but you did. You made me believe that night meant something to you, that I meant something to you. And then you woke up and treated me like I was nothing more than a convenient mistake. Something flickered in Grayson's eyes. Regret, perhaps, or pain. But it was gone so quickly Sophie wondered if she had imagined it. That night was... He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. It was complicated. My grandmother had just died. I wasn't thinking clearly. Stop. Sophie held up her hand, unable to bear hearing him dismiss their connection again. Just stop, I get it. You were grieving, you needed comfort, and I was there. Message received, loud and clear. Sophie. No. She moved toward him, her green eyes blazing with a combination of hurt and determination. Let me make something very clear to you, Grayson. I didn't plan this. I don't want your money. I don't want to trap you or force you into anything. But I am pregnant with your child, and I'm going to have this baby whether you want to be involved or not. Grayson stared at her, his expression cycling through emotions too quickly for her to read. You're sure it's mine? The question was quiet, almost gentle, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. Sophie felt the color drain from her face as the implication sank in. Get out, she whispered. Sophie, I had to ask. Get out! The words tore from her throat with such force that Grayson actually took a step back. How dare you? How dare you stand there and question whether I'm lying about this? Tears were streaming down her face now, but she didn't care. The man she had fallen in love with, the vulnerable, broken soul she had held in the darkness, was looking at her like she was a stranger trying to con him. I quit, she said, her voice shaking but determined. I'll pack my things and be gone by tonight. You don't have to worry about me or this baby ever again. She started toward the door, but Grayson's voice stopped her. You can't just leave. Sophie turned back, her heart breaking all over again at the sight of him. Even now, even after everything he had just said, she loved him, and that made it hurt so much worse. Watch me, she said quietly. If you're really pregnant, if it's really mine, we need to discuss this rationally. Arrangements need to be made, legalities need to be addressed. Legalities. Sophie laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Of course, that's what this is to you, isn't it? Another business transaction to be managed. I'm trying to be responsible here. No, you're trying to control a situation that scares you. Well, guess what, Grayson? Some things can't be controlled. Some things require you to actually feel something, to take a risk, to be vulnerable. And we both know how terrifying that is for you. Sophie walked to the door, then paused with her hand on the frame. When she spoke again, her voice was soft but final. When you decide whether you want to be a father or just a financial contributor, you know where to find me. But I won't wait forever for you to figure out how to be human. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from the person you love the most. Some absences echo louder than any presence ever could. The mansion felt different without Sophie. Not just empty, but hollow, like a shell missing its essential core. Grayson told himself it was merely the disruption of routine, the inconvenience of having to find and train a new housekeeper. But as weeks turned into months, he couldn't escape the truth that haunted every room. Sophie Bennett had taken something irreplaceable with her when she left. Mrs. Holloway had been icily professional in the aftermath of Sophie's departure, her disapproval evident in every clipped response and meaningful silence. She had hired a replacement within a week, Angela, a competent woman in her 50s who kept the house spotless and never presumed to arrange flowers with an artist's eye or hum while she worked. The new girl does adequate work, Mrs. Holloway reported during one of their weekly household meetings, her tone suggesting that adequate was a damning indictment. Grayson nodded absently, his attention caught by the kitchen window where Sophie used to stand in the mornings, steam from her coffee cup catching the early light. Good. That's good. Though she doesn't have Sophie's touch with the flowers, Mrs. Holloway continued pointedly. or her way with young Timothy when he visits. The boy keeps asking where she went. The mention of his nephew made Grayson's chest tighten. Timothy had indeed asked about Sophie repeatedly, his 8-year-old mind unable to understand why his favorite person in Uncle Gray's house had simply disappeared. "Children adapt," Grayson said curtly, ending the conversation. But children weren't the only ones struggling to adapt. Grayson found himself walking through his perfectly maintained mansion like a stranger, noticing all the small ways Sophie's absence had changed things. The flowers were arranged correctly but without soul. The kitchen was clean but no longer warm. The silence that had once been his refuge now felt oppressive, broken only by the grandfather clock's relentless marking of time. 3 months after Sophie left, Grayson stood in his study nursing a whiskey and staring at a private investigator's report he had commissioned and immediately regretted. The pages contained information he had told himself he needed for legal purposes: Sophie's current address, employment status, medical records that confirmed what he already knew to be true. She was 5 months pregnant. It was his child. The black and white ultrasound image paper-clipped to the file made his hands shake. A tiny profile, unmistakably human, growing inside the woman he had driven away with his fear and suspicion. His son or daughter, existing in a world he was no longer part of. The investigator's notes were clinical, professional. Subject employed part-time at Sunrise Diner in Echo Park, living in modest 1-bedroom apartment, prenatal care through county clinic. No evidence of financial support from other sources. County clinic. The words hit him like a physical blow. Sophie was carrying his child, an Adler heir, and receiving medical care at an understaffed public facility because he had been too much of a coward to face what he had done to her. Grayson's phone buzzed with a text from his sister Lauren. "Timothy's school play is tomorrow night. You promised you'd be there." He had forgotten. In the months since Sophie left, he had forgotten many things. Social obligations, family dinners, the simple rhythms of life that used to ground him. Work had become his only refuge, 18-hour days that left him too exhausted to dream about green eyes and golden hair. The next evening, Grayson sat in the elementary school auditorium watching his nephew play a tree in the 3rd-grade production of The Seasons. Timothy was earnest and adorable, his costume crafted with the loving attention that Lauren brought to everything involving her son. But as Grayson applauded his nephew's performance, all he could think about was whether his own child would ever perform in school plays, whether there would be anyone in the audience to cheer them on. "You look terrible," Lauren said bluntly as they walked to the parking lot after the show. "When's the last time you slept or ate a real meal?" "I'm fine," Grayson replied automatically. "No, you're not." Lauren stopped walking and faced him, her expression serious. "You haven't been fine since before Christmas. What happened, Gray? And don't tell me it's work stress. I know the difference." Grayson looked at his sister, really looked at her, and saw the concern in her familiar eyes. Lauren was the only family he had left, the only person who knew him before he became Grayson Adler, billionaire. She had loved him when he was just Gray, Elena's scared grandson who had nightmares and needed extra hugs. "I made a mistake," he said quietly. "A big one, and I don't know how to fix it." Lauren waited, understanding that pushing would only make him retreat further. "There was someone," Grayson continued, the words feeling rusty from disuse. "Someone who worked for me, and I hurt her. Badly." "The housekeeper," Lauren said softly. "Sophie." Grayson's head snapped up in surprise. "How did you—" "Timothy talked about her constantly, and Mrs. Holloway might be discreet with you, but she's known me since I was Timothy's age. She mentioned that Sophie left suddenly and that you've been impossible to live with ever since." They had reached Lauren's car, but she made no move to leave. Timothy was inside, probably already asleep against the window, exhausted from his theatrical debut. "Tell me what happened," Lauren said gently. So Grayson did. Not everything. Some wounds were too private to share even with family, but enough. He told her about Sophie's grace and dignity, about the night they had connected in ways that terrified him, about his cowardly retreat into suspicion and control when she needed him most. "She's pregnant," he finished quietly, "with my child, and I accused her of trying to trap me." Lauren was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what he had shared. When she spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "You're going to be an uncle again," she said, "and that baby is going to be Timothy's cousin." The words hit Grayson with unexpected force. He had been so focused on his own fear, his own regrets, that he hadn't fully considered the broader implications. This child would be Elena's great-grandchild, the continuation of a family line that had meant everything to the woman who raised him. "I don't think she wants me involved," Grayson said. "I said unforgivable things, Lauren. I questioned whether the baby was even mine." "Then you fix it," Lauren said firmly. "You apologize, you grovel if necessary, and you figure out how to be the man Elena raised you to be instead of the scared boy you're acting like. What if it's too late? Then at least you'll know you tried." Lauren reached out and squeezed his arm. "But Gray, don't wait too long. That baby is going to be born whether you're ready or not, and Sophie shouldn't have to face that alone." That night, Grayson sat in his study with the investigator's report spread before him, staring at the ultrasound image until his eyes blurred. Somewhere across the city, Sophie was probably getting ready for bed, her body changing as their child grew inside her. Was she scared? Excited? Did she ever think about him? Or had she managed to move on completely? His phone sat on the desk, her number still programmed despite everything. It would be so easy to call, to text, to reach across the chasm he had created with his fear and pride. But every time he reached for it, Elena's voice echoed in his memory. "Start small. Find one person who makes you want to try." He had found that person. He had held her in his arms and felt truly alive for the first time in years. And then he had destroyed it all because loving someone meant risking everything, and risk had always been his greatest enemy. Outside his windows, Los Angeles glittered like scattered diamonds, millions of lives playing out their own dramas of love and loss and second chances. Somewhere in that vast sprawl, Sophie was carrying his child, building a life that didn't include him because he had made it clear he didn't want to be included. Grayson picked up the ultrasound image, tracing the tiny profile with one finger. His son or daughter, innocent of the complicated fears and wounded pride that had driven their parents apart. But some mistakes can be unmade, if you're brave enough to try. Sometimes the heart knows what the mind is too afraid to admit. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Wednesday in late June, jolting Grayson from restless sleep with the shrill urgency that only middle-of-the-night phone calls possess. He fumbled for his phone, expecting business emergencies or family crises, anything except the unfamiliar number flashing on his screen. "Mr. Adler?" The voice was professional, clinical. "This is Iris Chen from UCLA Medical Center. I'm calling about Sophie Bennett." Grayson's blood turned to ice. He sat up abruptly, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What's wrong? Is she—" "She's in labor, sir. There are complications and—" The nurse paused, and Grayson could hear the weight of difficult decisions in her silence. "She listed you as an emergency contact. I think you should come." The drive to UCLA Medical Center passed in a blur of red lights and empty streets. Grayson's hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, his mind racing through every worst-case scenario. Sophie was only 7 months pregnant. Too early. Too dangerous. The baby wasn't due until August, and premature births could mean— He couldn't finish the thought. The hospital's fluorescent lights were harsh and unforgiving as Grayson rushed through automatic doors into the maternity ward. The smell of antiseptic and anxiety hit him immediately, along with the sounds of new life beginning and sometimes struggling to take hold. "I'm looking for Sophie Bennett," he told the nurse at the reception desk, his voice hoarse with panic he couldn't quite hide. "Are you family?" the nurse asked, her fingers poised over her computer keyboard. Grayson paused, the weight of labels settling around him. What was he exactly? The man who had loved Sophie for one perfect night and then spent months running from that love? The father of her child who had questioned her honesty and driven her away? "I'm the baby's father." The nurse's expression softened slightly. "Room 314. Dr. Martinez will want to speak with you." The elevator ride to the 3rd floor felt eternal. Grayson's reflection in the polished steel doors showed a man he barely recognized, hair disheveled, still wearing the sweatpants and t-shirt he had thrown on in his haste to leave the mansion. For once in his carefully controlled life, appearance was the last thing on his mind. Room 314 was a chaos of medical equipment and quiet urgency. Sophie lay in the hospital bed, her golden hair damp with perspiration, her face pale but determined. She looked smaller than he remembered, more fragile, and the sight of her in pain made something crack open in his chest. Iris, the nurse who had called him, stood beside the bed, monitoring numbers on various machines. She looked up when Grayson entered, her dark eyes assessing him with the sharp judgment of someone who had clearly heard all about what kind of man he was. "You came," Sophie said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course I came." Grayson moved closer to the bed, his hands hovering uncertainly in the space between them. He wanted to touch her, to offer comfort, but he had forfeited that right months ago. "How are you feeling? What's happening?" "Preeclampsia," Dr. Martinez explained, entering the room with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. Sophie's blood pressure spiked dangerously. "We're going to need to deliver the baby tonight." "But it's too early," Grayson said, his voice tight with fear. 32 weeks, the doctor confirmed. "Not ideal, but babies born at this stage have excellent survival rates with proper care. However, we need to move quickly." The next hour passed in a whirlwind of consent forms and medical preparations. Grayson found himself signing papers he barely read, authorizing procedures and making decisions that would affect 3 lives: Sophie's, the baby's, and his own. Through it all, Sophie remained remarkably calm, her focus entirely on doing whatever was necessary to keep their child safe. "I need to tell you something," Sophie said as they prepared to move her to the delivery room. Her green eyes found his across the controlled chaos of medical personnel. "I never wanted to keep you away from this baby. I was angry and hurt, but I never wanted that." "Sophie, let me finish," she said, her voice gaining strength despite her exhaustion. "This child deserves to know their father. And despite everything that happened between us, I know you're not a bad man. You're just scared." The simple truth of her words hit him harder than any accusation could have. She was right. He was scared, terrified of loving someone and losing them, of opening his heart only to watch it shatter. But lying in that hospital bed, fighting to bring their child safely into the world, Sophie was braver than he had ever been. "I was wrong," Grayson said, the words feeling both inadequate and necessary. "About everything. About you. About what happened between us. About—" He gestured helplessly around the room. "I've been wrong about everything that matters." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her since that night in December. "You're here now. That's what matters." The delivery room was a sterile symphony of monitors and medical voices, all focused on the miracle and crisis happening simultaneously. Grayson stood beside Sophie's bed, holding her hand as she pushed their child into the world with a strength that humbled him completely. "I can see the head," Dr. Martinez announced. "One more push, Sophie." The cry that filled the room was thin and reedy, but it was the most beautiful sound Grayson had ever heard. Through his tears he didn't remember beginning, he watched as the medical team worked to clear tiny airways and assess delicate systems. "It's a boy," Dr. Martinez said, holding up a small, perfectly formed human being who looked impossibly fragile and miraculously strong all at once. "Oliver." That was the name Sophie had chosen, she told him later, as they sat in the NICU watching their son sleep in his incubator. Oliver Bennett Adler, if Grayson wanted his name included. The hyphenated surname felt like forgiveness, like hope, like a second chance he didn't deserve but desperately wanted to earn. "He has your eyes," Sophie said softly, her finger tracing the glass of the incubator. Grayson stared at his son, and felt something fundamental shift in his chest. This tiny person, born too early but fighting with everything he had, was part of him and part of Sophie, a bridge between the man he had been and the man he wanted to become. "He's perfect," Grayson whispered. "He's going to need surgery," Sophie said quietly. "His lungs aren't fully developed and there might be other complications. The next few weeks we'll get through it," Grayson said, the words coming from a place of certainty he hadn't felt in months. "Whatever he needs, whatever you need, we'll figure it out." Sophie looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time since that December night he didn't try to hide behind walls or professional distance. He let her see everything, his fear, his love, his desperate hope that it wasn't too late to be the man she and Oliver deserved. "I love you," he said quietly, the words he should have spoken months ago finally finding their way out. "I love you and I love him, and I know I have no right to say that after everything I've done, but—" "Grayson," Sophie interrupted, her voice soft but clear, "I love you too." I never stopped, and in that sterile room filled with the sounds of new life struggling to take hold, 2 broken hearts began to heal. The greatest courage isn't facing death, it's choosing to live fully, despite knowing you might lose everything. 3 weeks in the NICU taught Grayson more about love than 35 years of careful living ever had. He learned that love was sitting beside an incubator at 3 a.m., counting each tiny breath as a victory. Love was watching Sophie pump breast milk with the dedication of someone training for the Olympics, determined to give Oliver every possible advantage. Love was the way his hands shook the first time the nurses let him hold his son. Skin-to-skin contact that felt like the most important business meeting of his life. Oliver was a fighter, despite being born 2 months early. Despite lungs that struggled, and a heart that occasionally forgot its rhythm, he grew stronger each day. The NICU became their second home, a world of monitors and medical schedules that somehow felt more real than the mansion Grayson had called home for years. His oxygen levels are improving, Dr. Martinez reported during one of their daily check-ins. Another week or two and we might be able to discuss taking him home. Home. The word had taken on new meaning over the past 3 weeks. Grayson's mansion felt empty and irrelevant compared to Sophie's tiny apartment in Echo Park, where he had been spending most of his time. Her landlord, Mrs. Valdez, had initially been suspicious of the well-dressed man who arrived with expensive coffee and designer baby supplies, but she had gradually warmed to him as she watched him struggle to assemble a crib with the determination of someone attempting international diplomacy. "You know," Sophie said one evening as they sat in the NICU's family lounge, watching Oliver sleep through the glass partition, "we need to talk about what happens next." Grayson's stomach clenched. Over the past 3 weeks, they had existed in a bubble of shared purpose and medical urgency. The complications of their relationship had been set aside in favor of more immediate concerns: Oliver's health, surgery schedules, the careful choreography of NICU life. But Sophie was right. They couldn't postpone the difficult conversations forever. "I know my apartment isn't suitable for a baby with medical needs," Sophie continued. "Especially not Oliver. He's going to need follow-up care, specialized equipment, things that require money." Grayson finished quietly. "I wasn't going to ask for money," Sophie said, her green eyes flashing with familiar pride. "I was going to ask for help. There's a difference." Grayson turned to face her fully, taking in the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the way she had lost weight, despite the fact that she was supposed to be recovering from childbirth. She had been living on hospital food and vending machine coffee, sleeping in uncomfortable chairs, pouring every ounce of her strength into willing their son to thrive. "What if there was another option?" he said carefully. Sophie's expression grew wary. "What kind of option?" "What if?" Grayson paused, gathering courage for the most important pitch of his life. "What if you and Oliver came to stay with me? Just temporarily, while he needs medical care. The mansion is certainly big enough and we could hire the best nurses, have all the equipment he need." "Grayson, let me finish," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I know I have no right to ask this. I know I destroyed your trust and hurt you in ways I can't undo. But this isn't about us. This is about Oliver getting the best possible care." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, her gaze returning to their son. "And what happens when he's better? When he doesn't need constant medical supervision anymore?" The question hung between them, loaded with all the fears and hopes they had been avoiding. Grayson could give her the safe answer. They would figure it out as they went, take things day by day. But 3 weeks of watching his son fight for life had taught him something Elena had tried to teach him years ago. Some moments required complete honesty, even when honesty was terrifying. "I want to marry you," he said quietly. Sophie's breath caught. "Grayson, I know it's too soon. I know I need to earn back your trust before I have any right to ask for forever. But I want you to know where my heart is, where it's been since the night Oliver was born. Maybe since the night he was conceived, if I'm being completely honest." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "You're scared of commitment. You told me yourself that you don't know how to let people in." "You're right," Grayson admitted. "I am scared, terrified actually. But I'm more scared of living without you and Oliver than I am of risking my heart. These past 3 weeks, watching you be the strongest person I've ever seen, watching our son fight for every breath. Sophie, you've both made me want to be braver than I've ever been." "Marriage isn't just about wanting to be brave," Sophie said softly. "It's about choosing to be brave every single day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Then ask me," Grayson said, moving closer to her on the uncomfortable lounge chairs. "Ask me the hard questions. Test me. Make me prove that I understand what I'm asking for." Sophie studied his face, searching for something only she could identify. "What happens the next time you get scared? The next time something happens that makes you want to put your walls back up?" "I promise to remember this moment," Grayson said. "I promise to remember what it felt like to almost lose you both, and how empty my life was when you were gone. I promise to choose love over fear, even when fear feels safer. And if you forget, if the fear wins, then you remind me," Grayson said simply. "You and Oliver." You remind me who I want to be, and I'll keep trying to become that man. Sophie was crying openly now, but she was also smiling. You realize you're proposing to me in a hospital lounge at 1 in the morning, wearing clothes you've been living in for 3 days? I'm realizing that none of the external things matter, Grayson said, reaching for her hands. Not the money, not the mansion, not the perfect timing or romantic settings. What matters is that I love you. What matters is that we created something beautiful together, and I want to spend the rest of my life protecting that beauty. We don't have a ring, Sophie said, but her voice was soft with wonder rather than complaint. Grayson smiled, reaching into his pocket to pull out the simple gold band that had belonged to Elena, the ring his grandmother had worn for 60 years of marriage to a man who loved her completely. Grandma Elena would want you to have this, he said, slipping the ring onto Sophie's finger. She always said that real love wasn't about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone worth growing with. Sophie stared at the ring, tears streaming down her cheeks. It's beautiful. But Grayson, are you sure? Really sure? Because I won't survive having my heart broken again. Then I'll just have to make sure it never breaks, Grayson said, pulling her into his arms. I love you, Sophie Bennett. I love our son, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that some walls are meant to come down. Through the glass partition, Oliver stirred in his incubator, his tiny hand reaching toward the light, as if he could sense that something monumental was happening, something that would change the trajectory of all their lives. Yes, Sophie whispered against Grayson's lips. Yes, I'll marry you. But we're doing this right. Slowly, carefully, building something real. We have time, Grayson said, holding her close as dawn began to lighten the Los Angeles sky outside the hospital windows. We have all the time in the world. And in that moment, with their son breathing steadily nearby and their futures intertwined like their fingers, two people who had been afraid to love learned that the greatest risk was also the greatest reward. Some love stories end where they begin, with two hearts learning to trust the possibility of forever. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows of the modest craftsman house in Silver Lake, casting warm light across the breakfast table, where Oliver Adler was methodically destroying a stack of blueberry pancakes. At 2.5, he had inherited his father's determination and his mother's gentle spirit, along with an impressive ability to wear more food than he consumed. "Dada more," Oliver announced, holding up sticky fingers toward Grayson, who was attempting to read the morning news while simultaneously preventing their son from painting the kitchen walls with syrup. "Say please, buddy," Grayson reminded gently, cutting another small piece of pancake and placing it on Oliver's high chair tray. "Peas," Oliver said with a grin that could melt glaciers, the same grin that had convinced his parents to move closer to UCLA Medical Center, to choose love over luxury, to build a life measured in moments rather than square footage. Sophie emerged from the bedroom wearing scrubs, her golden hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. After Oliver's birth, she had enrolled in nursing school, inspired by the incredible NICU staff who had helped save their son's life. She was 6 months away from graduation, and Grayson had never been more proud of anyone in his life. "How's my favorite patient this morning?" she asked, kissing the top of Oliver's head before moving to the coffee maker. "Clean bill of health from Dr. Martinez yesterday," Grayson reported, standing to wrap his arms around his wife from behind. The simple gold band on her finger caught the morning light. Elena's ring, worn now for over a year of marriage built on patience, honesty, and the kind of love that grows stronger through testing. "No more monthly checkups?" Sophie asked, leaning back against his chest. "Every 6 months now. He's officially caught up to his adjusted age." Grayson's voice carried the wonder that still hit him sometimes, the reality that their son, who had fought so hard in those early weeks, was now a healthy, thriving toddler who climbed everything, questioned everything, and loved everything with the fearless enthusiasm of someone who had never learned to be afraid. The front door opened with the familiar jingle of keys, followed by Mrs. Holloway's voice calling out, "Good morning, family." The older woman had insisted on following them when they moved out of the mansion, claiming that someone needed to keep an eye on their domestic arrangements. In reality, she had become Oliver's devoted grandmother figure, the bridge between the world they had left behind and the life they were building together. "Perfect timing," Sophie said, grabbing her travel mug and kissing Oliver's sticky cheek. "I have clinicals until 6, but I should be home for dinner." "We'll be here," Grayson said, meaning it in the way that still surprised him sometimes. 2 years ago, the idea of rearranging his schedule around family dinner would have seemed impossible. Now it was the most important appointment in his calendar. After Sophie left for school and Mrs. Holloway settled in with Oliver, Grayson drove to the downtown office where Adler Hospitality had relocated. The corporate headquarters was smaller now, more efficient, more focused on sustainable growth than aggressive expansion. Some of his board members had initially questioned the changes, but the results spoke for themselves. Employee satisfaction was up, turnover was down, and the company's reputation for ethical business practices had become their strongest marketing tool. "Your 2 p.m. canceled," his assistant Jade reported as he settled at his desk. "But your sister called. Timothy's soccer game is this Saturday and she wanted to confirm you'd be there." "Absolutely, put it on my calendar." Grayson smiled, thinking of his nephew, who had appointed himself Oliver's primary protector and entertainment committee. "And block out Sunday morning. Sophie's graduation is next week and we're having a celebration lunch." "Already handled," Jade said, with the efficiency that reminded him daily why promoting her from the secretarial pool had been one of his better decisions. "Mrs. Adler's parents are flying in from Portland, and I've made reservations at that little place in Los Feliz you like." Grayson nodded, still amazed sometimes by the life he had built, a life that included in-laws who had welcomed him despite his rocky beginning with their daughter, family celebrations that mattered more than business acquisitions, a calendar marked by school plays and doctor visits and soccer games, rather than just board meetings and profit reports. His phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. Oliver's first attempt at "I love you" this morning was, "I love ooh. Thought you should know your son is already a charmer." Grayson smiled, typing back, "He gets that from his mother. See you tonight." The afternoon passed in the normal rhythm of conference calls and contract reviews, but Grayson found his attention drifting to the framed photo on his desk. Oliver's first birthday party, held in their small backyard with a dozen close friends and family members. Sophie was laughing at something Timothy had said. Oliver was covered in chocolate cake, and Mrs. Holloway was pretending to scold them all while secretly taking pictures with her phone. It was nothing like the formal dinner parties at the mansion, nothing like the carefully orchestrated events that had once defined his social life. It was messy and loud and absolutely perfect. At 5:30, Grayson closed his laptop and headed home, a routine that had become sacred. No late meetings, no business dinners that stretched past bedtime stories. He had learned, through trial and error and Sophie's patient guidance, that being present meant more than just being physically in the same room. It meant choosing again and again to prioritize the people he loved over the things that felt urgent but weren't actually important. When he walked through the front door, Oliver rushed toward him with the unsteady enthusiasm of a toddler who had discovered the joy of running everywhere. "Dada! Home!" Oliver announced, throwing his arms around Grayson's legs. "I'm home, buddy," Grayson agreed, scooping his son into his arms and breathing in the scent of baby shampoo and goldfish crackers that had become the perfume of happiness. Sophie arrived 20 minutes later, tired but glowing with the satisfaction of someone pursuing a dream she had thought was impossible. Over dinner, take-out Chinese food eaten around the kitchen table while Oliver narrated his day in a mix of recognizable words and enthusiastic babbling. They talked about her classes, his day at the office, their weekend plans, normal things, beautiful things, the kind of ordinary moments that Grayson had once thought were boring, but now recognized as the building blocks of a life worth living. Later, after Oliver was asleep and they were curled together on the couch watching a movie neither of them was really paying attention to, Sophie turned to him with the expression he had learned, meant she was about to say something important. "I've been thinking," she said, her head resting on his shoulder. "About what?" "About how different our life is from what either of us planned. You were supposed to be this untouchable bachelor billionaire, and I was supposed to be—" She paused, considering. "I don't know what I was supposed to be, but probably not married to my former boss with a toddler who thinks airplane means throwing food across the kitchen." Grayson laughed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Are you complaining?" "No," Sophie said quickly. "Never. I'm just amazed, I guess, that we found each other, that we figured out how to make this work despite all the ways we could have gotten it wrong." "We did get it wrong," Grayson reminded her gently. "Remember? I was an ass, you quit. We spent months apart, but we found our way back," Sophie said, lifting her head to look at him. "That's what matters. We found our way back to each other." Grayson cupped her face in his hands, marveling at the woman who had taught him that love wasn't about avoiding risks. It was about finding someone worth taking risks for. "I love you, Sophie Adler," he said, the words still carrying the wonder of something miraculous and everyday all at once. "I love you too," she replied, and kissed him with the tenderness of someone who had learned that the best love stories weren't about perfect people finding each other, but about imperfect people choosing to grow together. Outside their little house, Los Angeles hummed with its usual energy, millions of people pursuing their own dreams of connection and meaning. But inside, in the warm glow of table lamps and the soft sound of their son's steady breathing from the next room, two people who had almost lost each other had found something better than perfection. They had found home. What would you have done in Sophie's place when Grayson questioned the paternity? Would you have stayed and fought for the relationship, or would you have walked away to protect your heart? Your participation in this channel is very important to us. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below, letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.